12 o'clock.
We've got incoming. Brace for impact.
The Mitchell came in so low that the sea filled the windscreen. Spray hammered the glass, torn up by the slipstream as the twin engines dragged the B-25 down toward the line of white water and gray steel ahead. The pilot could see the Japanese freighter clearly now, a long, dark shape knifing through the Pacific swells, its wake foaming, tiny flashes of light dancing along its rails as anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. Inside the nose, just in front of his boots, sat the thing that made this Mitchell different from every other bomber he had flown. A cannon. A real cannon. The 75mm M4 gun ran almost the length of the nose, the breech block reaching back under the flight deck. Around it the metal looked bruised and overbuilt, stiffeners and plates bolted and riveted wherever the engineers had thought the recoil might try to twist this airplane apart. A cradle and spring system crouched under the pilot's seat, ready to swallow 21 inches of recoil each time the gun spoke. Behind the pilot, hunched in the narrow space that had once been the bombardier's world, the navigator cradled a 15-pound shell in gloved hands. He could feel the vibration of the engines through the cartridge casing, smell cordite from the last practice firing still lingering in the confined space. He slid the shell forward, wrestled it into the open breech, and slammed it shut with a hard metallic clack that echoed over the roar. "Gun up," he shouted, voice lost in the noise but clear enough over the interphone. The pilot's left thumb flicked the arming switch for the twin. 50 caliber machine guns nestled alongside the cannon. His right index finger curled around the small trigger switch on the wheel, the one the armorers had wired to the big gun. Ahead, the freighter was close now, so close he could see individual men running on the deck, tiny stick figures against the gray hull. Tracer rounds from the ship's guns streaked past, some whickering under the wings, some whipping overhead. The Mitchell bucked slightly as enemy rounds found the air around it, but the pilot held his course, running in straight and level at mast height. The altimeter needle hovered barely above zero. He squeezed the trigger for the nose guns first. Twin streams of tracers leapt out, stitching across the water, then walking up the hull toward the bridge, a line of fire that gave him something to steer by. The freighter's bow swelled in the windscreen. He nudged the nose a fraction, felt the moment click in his muscles, then flipped the selector and thumbed the cannon trigger. For a heartbeat there was nothing but the familiar scream of engines and the thrum of the airframe. Then the Mitchell coughed. A deep, hollow thud shook the airplane, as if a giant had kicked it in the chest. The nose jumped, the whole aircraft shuddering as the 75mm round leapt down the barrel and into the sea of air between bomber and ship. The spring cradle under his seat squeezed and recoiled, eating the worst of the kick, but the pilot still felt it in his spine. Out ahead, halfway between air and water, a pale flash slammed into the freighter's side. A blossom of smoke and metal erupted just above the waterline. Men on the deck disappeared in spray and debris. Hit! Hit! Someone yelled in his headphones. There was no time to celebrate. The navigator was already wrestling another shell into the breech, the nose gunner hammering out a second burst to range in. The pilot held his nerve and his altitude, skimming so low he felt sure the next wave would reach up and drag them under. He squeezed the cannon trigger again. In the violent, rattling seconds that followed, every man aboard knew they were riding something new. This medium bomber that had once floated high above targets in loose formations was now a low-level predator, armed with a weapon more at home in the turret of a tank than in the nose of an airplane. It had not been designed that way. Before anyone thought to turn it into a flying cannon, the B-25 Mitchell was a very different machine. When North American Aviation rolled out the first prototype in early 1939, The United States Army Air Corps had asked for a fast medium bomber with a crew of 5, the ability to carry about 3,000 pounds of bombs, and a range to fly at medium altitude into enemy territory and back. The result was a twin-engine, twin-tail aircraft with a clear glass nose for a bombardier to lie in, peering down through a bomb sight as the pilot droned along on a straight course. By all accounts, the Mitchell was rugged, forgiving, and easy to maintain. It could be built in huge numbers, turned out by factories at Inglewood in California and Kansas City in Kansas. Crews liked it. Mechanics could fix it in muddy fields with limited tools. It carried a respectable defensive armament for its day, machine guns in the nose, dorsal and ventral turrets, sometimes waist positions, but it was a bomber first, meant to drop explosives from a distance rather than duel with ships and fighters at point-blank range. When the war began for the United States in December 1941, B-25s were already in service on the West Coast, where one of them helped sink the first Japanese submarine of the conflict. A few months later, 16 Mitchells catapulted the type to fame when they lumbered off the deck of the carrier USS Hornet and headed for Tokyo under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Their low-level dash over Japanese cities in April 1942 looked daring and improvised. But even those raiders flew their B-25Bs more or less as designed bombers with modest guns, not gunships. Out in the Southwest Pacific, though, the war was changing faster than the aircraft on the production lines. There, General George Kenney's 5th Air Force faced a cruel geometry of distances and sea lanes. Japan's garrisons in New Guinea and the islands beyond depended on ships, fast destroyers, transports, barges creeping along the coastlines at night. The Allies had few warships to spare. Land-based aircraft would have to do the work of interdicting those lifelines. High-altitude bombing had not proved particularly effective against moving ships. In early efforts against Japanese convoys, hundreds of sorties and tons of bombs had produced only a handful of hits. Something different was needed, something that could strike low and hard and often. That something began with a man who, on paper, was not an engineer at all. Paul Irvin Gunn was an Arkansas-born mechanic and pilot who had left the U.S. Navy after World War I as a chief petty officer and gone to work flying and maintaining civilian airliners in the Philippines. When war swept over the islands in 1941, he shepherded the remnants of Philippine Airlines fleet south to Australia under fire. In uniform again as an Army Air Forces officer, he became the master of improvisation in Kenney's theater. Everyone knew him by the nickname that clung to him like oil stains to his flight suit, Pappy. Gunn was not the sort of man who waited patiently for new aircraft to arrive from the factory. He looked at what he had on hand, a mixture of Douglas, a 20 Havocs and B-25 Mitchells, and at the problem in front of him, Japanese ships that needed to be sunk. Then he started cutting up airplanes. In 1942, working with Australian workshops and whatever scrap he could scrounge, Gunn and his team in the 81st Depot Repair Squadron began stripping 50 caliber Browning machine guns from wrecked fighters and mounting them in solid noses on a 20s. They added extra fuel tanks for range and removed defensive turrets that were useless at low level. The result was a light bomber that could roar in at mast height, hosing a ship's decks with heavy fire as its bombs skipped into the hull. They replaced a glazed bombardier's nose with a metal one packed full of forward-firing Brownings for later 6 or even 8 guns to create what they called commerce destroyers. In doing so, they made the Mitchell nose heavy, shook rivets loose with the ferocity of its own gunfire, and discovered every weakness in its structure the hard way. But they also stumbled onto something powerful. When those modified B-25s and A-20s joined Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters in early 1943, their impact was dramatic. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, that March, low-level strafing and massed height bombing turned a Japanese convoy into a floating graveyard. B-25s and A-20s came in low, their noses spitting fire as they drove home 501,000-pound bombs into troop-packed freighters and destroyers. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. All 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers were sunk, nearly 3,000 men killed. The battle convinced Tokyo that New Guinea could no longer be supplied by large convoys and forced a shift towards smaller, more vulnerable shipping. Gunn's cobbled-together strafers had helped prove a new doctrine. If you could bring enough firepower to bear up close, a medium bomber could punch far above its weight in the anti-shipping role. The Army, Air Forces, and North American Aviation took notice. Back in the United States, designers and ordnance officers were wrestling with a related idea that had been floating around since before the war. Tests with a Douglas B-18 Bolo as early as 1938 had shown that it was technically possible to mount a large field artillery piece, a 75mm gun, in the nose of a bomber and fire it forward. The gun in question, the M4, was a development of the classic French 75 of World War I, adapted to tank turrets, and suited to punching holes in steel and concrete. Putting that sort of weapon into an airplane, however, was more than a matter of bolting it to the floor. A 75mm cannon fired shells roughly 2.5 inches in diameter, each weighing around 15 to 20 pounds depending on the type of round. In a Sherman tank, the cannon's recoil was absorbed by the mass of the vehicle and its suspension. In a 20,000-pound medium bomber, much of that recoil would be felt by structures that were never meant to withstand such sudden forces. Each shot would drive the gun backward almost 2 feet inside the nose. Without careful engineering, something would have to give, and it might be the aircraft itself. The initial fuselage section built for tests looked like a Frankenstein piece. The forward part of a B-25, complete with nose, mounted on a test stand so it could be towed out into a safe firing area in California. Engineers installed the M4 in a reinforced cradle that extended back under where the pilot's seat would normally go, combining a stout mount with a spring recoil system to swallow that 21-inch kick. Every time the gun fired in trials, they watched for cracked welds, popped rivets, buckled stringers. Lacking computer models, they learned by firing and then crawling over the structure with gauges and flashlights. Gradually, the metal evolved. Extra plates here, thicker longerons there, small gussets and braces wherever stress showed itself. Only when they were convinced that the structure could endure repeated firing did they move the gun into an actual aircraft. The prototype, a B-25C1 serial number 4113296, was rebuilt into the B-25G. The long glazed nose disappeared, replaced by a shorter armored snout with the cannon's barrel protruding slightly from the lower left side. The breech sat just in front of what had been the co-pilot's position, reachable by a crewman. 2 fixed. 50 calibers joined the cannon in the nose, giving the pilot something to walk onto target with tracers before unleashing a shell. At the same time, the crew layout inside changed. The old bombardier/navigator's prone station vanished. In its place, the navigator shifted back and up, becoming a combination navigator and cannoneer. Once the airplane leveled out on an attack run, he would crouch over the cannon's breech, grab a shell from nearby racks, and load by hand, working in rhythm with the pilot's calls and the shudder of each shot. From the beginning, there were skeptics. Some in the Air Forces were already sold on skip bombing and forward-firing machine guns. They argued that the complexity of installing a cannon that could manage only a handful of rounds per attack was an unnecessary distraction. Others pointed to the risk. If the recoil caused a structural failure, the loss of aircraft and crew would be hard to justify. Medium bomber doctrine had not been written with tank guns in mind. But there were also advocates who saw vulnerabilities in Japanese shipping and island fortifications that a high-velocity cannon could exploit. A single 75mm shell, if it hit low on a ship's side, could rip through plates and flood compartments without the need to lay a pattern of bombs. Against coastal bunkers, it might punch through concrete that 50 caliber bullets could only chip. And then there were men like Pappy Gunn, already experimenting with turning B-25s into blunt instruments out in the field. As the 5th Air Force tried its own cannon-equipped Mitchell on operations in mid-1943, the line between factory and field innovation blurred. In July of that year, Gunn flew a B-25 carrying a 75mm in the nose and used it to blast a Japanese transport aircraft out of the sky, scoring an unlikely aerial victory with what was essentially flying artillery. At other times, he aimed its big shells at destroyers off Cape Gloucester, discovering how difficult it could be to hit nimble, zigzagging warships with a weapon that fired slowly and demanded precision at low altitude. By late 1942 and early 1943, the development tracks converged. The Army officially requested a cannon-armed B-25. North American refined the experimental B-25G into a production standard, and the first B-25G series aircraft rolled off the line in 1943, followed by an even more heavily armed B-25H variant with a lighter T-13E1 cannon and a forest of additional machine guns. For the crews who would fly them, the technical diagrams and requisition orders boiled down to something simple and unnerving. Their bomber now carried one of the largest guns ever put on an American aircraft. Training for that fact began far from enemy fire. In gunnery ranges over the United States, pilots and crews of new B-25Gs learned a new sort of attack profile. Instead of climbing to 10,000 feet and droning toward a bomb release point, they practiced fast, shallow dives and low-level approaches on painted hulks and target rafts. Instructors emphasized that the cannon was a precision weapon by air standards. You could not throw shells around like machine gun bullets. You had, at most, 21 rounds aboard, and in a single pass, you might fire 3 or 4 before pulling away. The pilot learned to use the twin 50s next to the cannon as a kind of sight. In practice runs, he would open fire at range, watching the orange tracer streams reach out toward the target. If the line of fire walked too low, he eased the nose up. Too high, he pushed down. When the tracers were hammering the place he wanted the shell to go, he thumbed the cannon trigger, feeling the aircraft shiver with the shot. For the navigator, training was unsurprising in content and shocking in strain. He crawled into the cramped space beside the breech and rehearsed loading until muscle memory took over. Reach up, grab shell, align, shove, twist, slam the breech block shut. After a firing, deal with the spent casing. Early in the program, some aircraft fitted with ports simply dropped the huge brass cases out of the nose. That seemed fine until one shell casing, tumbling away, struck another aircraft. Later procedures called for stowing the empties back in racks, adding still more labor to those brief frantic moments. Pilots reported that the recoil felt different than they had expected. Some had feared a violent kick that would jerk the nose off line or stall a wing. The cradle and springs did their job. Crews later said the sensation was more like a car engine coughing on a cold morning, a heavy tremor but not a punch, though each shot could still perturb sensitive instruments. Compasses might swing wildly with every blast, forcing navigators to recalibrate on the fly. Instructors drove home the most important rule: do not fixate. A pilot concentrating too hard on lining up a perfect cannon shot could easily forget his altitude and fly straight into the water or a hillside. The cannon was a tool, not a reason to commit suicide. Eventually, there was nothing left to practice. The Cannon Mitchells had to go to war. The first B-25Gs began arriving in the Southwest Pacific in mid-1943. Their short noses and protruding barrels drawing curious crowds at airfields around Brisbane and Port Moresby. Among the sun-faded A-20s and early B-25s patched with field modifications, they looked like something the Armor Branch had dreamed up by mistake. 5th Air Force commanders were eager to see what they could do. The missions they received were often the same ones that had driven Gunn to his original experiments: anti-shipping sweeps against barges, small convoys, and coastal traffic hugging the shorelines of New Guinea and New Britain. In these missions, the big gun offered a murderous kind of discretion. Instead of expending valuable bombs on a single barge or gunboat, a B-25G might use its 75mm rounds to punch holes exactly where they would do the most damage. Crews learned to approach along the coast, staying low over the jungle until the last minute, then popping out over the water for a short, terrifying run at their targets. On one such sweep along the coast of New Guinea, a B-25G pilot rolled in on a Japanese barge convoy at dawn, mist hanging low over the sea. The barges, tiny and dark in the half-light, suddenly came alive with greenish tracers. The Mitchell knife between palm-fringed headlands, nose guns spitting, then lofted a pair of cannon shells into the lead barge. The first short round smashed into the water just ahead. The second slammed into the hull, ripping it apart in a flash of orange and black. On other days, cannon-armed Mitchells were thrown against more substantial targets. Japanese destroyers sent on Tokyo Express-style missions to resupply and evacuate troops along the New Guinea and New Britain coasts made fat yet dangerous targets. Flying at mast height toward a modern destroyer bristling with guns took nerve even without a 75mm to worry about. With one, the pressure was doubled. A pilot knew that if he lined up his approach perfectly, he might punch a shell into the engine room or magazine. He also knew that a single lucky burst of flak could turn his bomber into a sheet of flame. Some B-25G crews claimed hits that set ships ablaze or left them dead in the water. Others, like Gunn's own efforts off Cape Gloucester, found that zigzagging destroyers could often spoil their aim, wasting precious rounds. After one such mission, a navigator spent an evening in a tent at WWII airfield, staring at his bruised forearms from manhandling shells while tracers had stitched the air around them, wondering aloud whether he had done anything that the older machine gun strafers could not have managed with less fuss. If the cannon's record against warships was mixed, it came into its own in another role, smashing fixed targets along coastlines. Along the north coast of New Guinea, at places like WWII, Madang, and Hansa Bay, the Japanese built fuel dumps, gun positions, and warehouses as close to the water as possible. The 5th Air Force's airdrome raids against WWII in August 1943 were dominated by bombers and fighters attacking airfields, but as the campaign wore on, cannon-armed B-25s became a handy way to knock out stubborn concrete revetments, coastal batteries, and cargo caves. A well-placed 75mm round into the mouth of a cave could transform it into a funeral pyre for the supplies inside. The Pacific, however, was bigger than New Guinea. Even as 5th Air Force refined its gunship tactics, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps began to look at the Cannon Mitchell for their own island-hopping operations. The Navy designated its B-25s as PBJ-1s, and the PBJ-1H variant was essentially a B-25H fitted out for maritime war. It carried the same 75mm cannon in the nose, 8 forward-facing, 50 calibers, bombs, and often rocket rails under the wings. Marines of squadrons like VMB 6113, based on specks of coral like Tarawa and later on atolls in the Marshall Islands, took these aircraft into action against Japanese shipping and shore installations around places like Maolawau up in Wachi in early 1944. A typical Marine PBJ mission might begin in the pre-dawn dark, the crew stumbling across wet sand toward their bomber as ground crewmen swabbed the cannon barrel and loaded the racks with shells. The pilot would taxi out under waving palms, the big nose gun bobbing slightly with every bump, and then roar off over reefs and black water toward a lagoon ringed with enemy guns. On approach, the PBJs would skim low, rockets slung under the wings for a final punch, the nose guns cutting paths through palm tops and brush as the pilot tried to keep the horizon steady. At the right moment, he might loose a pair of rockets at a pier head, squeeze the 50s at a gun position, and then, if he judged it worth the risk, line the big gun up on a beached freighter hulk being used as a fuel store. 1 or 2 75mm rounds into the waterline could touch off a column of fire that marked the target for others to finish. For the men inside these flying cannons, every mission was an exercise in cognitive dissonance. On paper, they were bomber crews trained in formation flying, navigation, and level bombing. In practice, their daily work felt closer to that of attack pilots or even tank destroyer crews, except that their tank flew at 200 miles an hour a few dozen feet above the sea. Pilots learned to feel subtle changes in the air through their fingertips. The way ground effect made the airplane float as they skimmed over water. The way a swell could lull them into thinking they were higher than they were. They became obsessively aware of speed, altitude, and attitude. A moment's inattention while focusing on the cannon's crosshairs could mean digging a wingtip into a wave or clipping a treetop. Navigators and cannoneers faced their own battle against claustrophobia and fatigue. The space around the cannon breech was cramped, even by bomber standards. During long transits over open ocean, they might sit on ammo boxes or squat on the floor, trying to stretch sore backs in the attack run. That space shrank to a tiny universe of metal and noise recoil springs compressing inches from their knees, shell cases clanging, sweat running into eyes as they fought to line up round after round with fingers numb from shock. Gunners, crammed in dorsal, waist, and tail positions, rode out each cannon firing like a sudden shove. Some described feeling the blast as a dull thump transmitted through the airframe. Others swore they could tell when the cannon was about to go off by the slight tightening of the pilot's shoulders ahead of them. Then there was the noise. A B-25 was never quiet. Even in cruise, conversation without the interphone was impossible. At low level, with engines at high power and slipstream tearing at open gun ports, the inside of the airplane became a metal drum. When the 75mm fired, the sound was so deep and abrupt that it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A chest-thumping boom that you felt rather than heard as a distinct note. Between missions, crews talked about the cannon the way infantrymen talked about a new rifle. Some loved it. They told stories of spectacular hits, shells smashing barges in half, gun pits erupting, fuel dumps sending pillars of smoke climbing into the Pacific sky. To them, the gun was a righteous hammer, proof that their side could innovate faster than the enemy. Others were less sure, intense. Sweat-stained tent discussions over coffee that smelled faintly of engine oil. They would point out that the cannon often sat unused on missions where weather, targets, or tactics just did not suit its use. A Mitchell burdened with a 75mm and its ammunition carried less in the bomb bay. Against dispersed jungle targets, the big gun was often overkill or simply irrelevant, and always lurking at the back of every pilot's mind was the knowledge that each attack run demanded flying low and straight at a target spewing metal back at them. Over time, a pattern emerged. In some theaters and missions, the cannon-armed B-25s proved genuinely useful. Against lightly escorted shipping, against fixed coastal installations, against barges and gunboats, their ability to land a few heavy blows precisely where they were needed had tactical value. Marine PBJ-1Hs and Army B-25GX in the Central and Southwest Pacific racked up a steady but unspectacular tally of destroyed and damaged targets, contributing to the slow strangulation of Japan's outer defenses. In other roles, the cannon's limitations became more obvious. The rate of fire was inherently slow. A skilled crew could manage 3 or 4 shots in a single pass before the pilot had to break away. Each shell demanded careful loading and handling. If the breech jammed or a shell hung up, the navigator had to wrestle with a mechanism not designed with in-flight maintenance in mind, all while buffeted by turbulence and perhaps wounded. The gun's recoil, while tamed, still complicated other tasks. Compasses and sensitive instruments could be thrown off by each blast. The added weight in the nose changed the aircraft's handling and performance. In the B-25H, where the cannon was combined with up to 14 forward-firing, 50 caliber machine guns, rockets, and a normal or reduced bomb load, the airplane reached the limits of what a medium bomber could realistically carry in armament. Field units began to adapt once more, just as Gunn had done at the start. In some 5th Air Force squadrons, ground crews quietly removed the 75mm cannon from B-25Gs and Hs and replaced it with additional 50 calibers, or simply left the nose as a pure machine gun battery. The lighter weight improved performance and allowed crews to keep their preferred low-level tactics without the extra complexity. The Far East Air Forces would eventually redesignate cannon-removed aircraft as G1 or H1. Recognizing the change in official paperwork. By late 1944 and into 1945, the B-25's evolution was moving past the big gun. The final major production variant, the B-25J, combined lessons from both the original bomber and the gunships. It reintroduced a transparent nose in many aircraft for level bombing, but often swapped it for a strifer, nose packed with multiple 50 calibers, waist, dorsal, and tail guns, plus under fuselage gun packs on some aircraft, gave the J-motto a withering volume of fire without the need for a single heavy cannon. Rockets slung under the wings added yet another punch. In this final form, the Mitchell became, arguably, one of the most heavily armed medium bombers of the war, capable of carving apart trains, barges, small ships, and airfields with cascades of bullets and bombs. Did the 75mm cannon Mitchell change the Pacific War? Not in the sense that a single weapon or design can be said to have altered a continent-spanning conflict by itself. The war in the Pacific turned on grander hinges, the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal, the industrial might of American shipyards and factories, the grinding campaigns through New Guinea, the Solomons, the Central Pacific, and the Philippines. No single aircraft, no matter how formidable, decided it alone. Yet in another, more nuanced way, those cannon-nosed Mitchells and the men who built and flew them did help change how that war was fought. They were part of a family of innovations that transformed medium bombers and attack aircraft from altitude-bound, formation-driven machines into flexible, low-level weapons tailored to the unique geography and logistics of the Pacific. When Pappy Gunn began bolting extra guns into noses in Queensland workshops, When engineers at North American built test rigs to see how much recoil a Mitchell's nose could endure, they were pushing against the boundaries of pre-war doctrine. They were admitting, implicitly, that the textbooks had not anticipated a campaign like New Guinea. The success at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the relentless pounding of WWII airfield, the choking of Japanese barge traffic along the coasts, all of these depended on aircraft that could swoop low and hit hard. Gunn strafers and the factory-built B-25G and H variants were bricks in that new edifice, each representing a willingness to reimagine what a bomber was for. They also symbolized something deeper about wartime innovation. In peacetime, the idea of taking a successful bomber, ripping out its bombardier station, and shoving a tank gun into its nose would have seemed reckless at best, lunatic at worst. Accountants and safety boards would have balked. The cost in aborted test flights, damaged airframes, and extra training would have appeared unjustifiable. Under the pressure of war, the calculus changed. Every Japanese ship that reached New Guinea carried men and material that would kill Allied soldiers. Every convoy that slipped through the gauntlet lengthened the campaign. Against that backdrop, a cannon Mitchell lost in testing might be considered a grim but acceptable risk. Engineers and pilots found themselves in an environment where the phrase, "let's try it," could overcome layers of bureaucratic caution. This did not make them reckless fools. On the contrary, the story of the flying cannon Mitchells is as much about methodical engineering as it is about daring. The test fuselages fired repeatedly out on dusty ranges before anyone took the gun into battle. The field modifications in Australia were not haphazard hacks, but carefully considered compromises based on experience and the materials at hand. Manuals and pilot training documents incorporated the lessons of early mishaps. Still, in the end, it came down to people. To Pappy Gunn, stalking around a hangar in Townsville with a wrench in his hand and a new idea in his head. Brow furrowed as he imagined how to route ammunition belts or support a gun mount using scrap steel. To anonymous North American engineers, hunched over drafting tables late into evenings in Inglewood and Kansas City, translating field reports into revised blueprints, erasing and redrawing nose sections as the cannon's cradle grew more robust and the ammunition racks more accessible. To young pilots who had never seen the Pacific until they flew over it, trying to keep their hands steady as they dove at a ship for the first time, trusting that the reinforced nose ahead of them would hold together when the big gun fired. To navigators who became cannoneers by necessity, who learned to load and clear a 75mm breach in turbulence and smoke, who bore the bruises on their shoulders and forearms as quiet badges of their trade, to gunners who kept their fingers on twin 50 triggers, eyes scanning for zeros and for the arcs of their own tracers crossing the sea below, to ground crews who swabbed barrels, changed engine cylinders, patched holes, and listened for the distinctive boom returning over the strip, a signal that their airplane had used its unusual weapon and somehow survived to tell the story. Across the vastness of the Pacific, in jungles and on coral runways, those people gave metal its meaning. When the war ended, most of the cannon-armed Mitchells were scrapped, their guns removed, their airframes melted down. The 75mm experiment did not survive into the jet age. Later aircraft would carry big guns of their own, but the immediate post-war focus turned toward speed, altitude, and nuclear loads, not flying artillery pieces. In memory, the B-25 was often fixed as the Doolittle Raider, the North African workhorse, the generic medium bomber, not the squat-nosed gunship with a cannon under its pilot's feet. Yet if you look at photographs from 1943 and 1944, You can see the silhouette of the flying cannon Mitchell lurking behind the more famous images. A short-nosed B-25G or H on a muddy strip, its nose arch cheerful and its barrel blackened. A PBJ-1H on a coral reef, Marines lounging in its shade, while armorers lug heavy shells toward the open-nose hatch. A maintenance man at Tarawa or Dabadura standing hip-deep in sand or mud as he oils the breech, the midday sun gleaming off spent brass casings in a pile at his feet. Every one of those photos is a reminder that the familiar outline of the B-25 hides a story of constant change. The Mitchell that rolled off the line in 1939 as a neat, glass-nosed medium bomber had, by 1945, been turned inside out, bombardiers' windows replaced by armor and guns, turrets moved, positions added and removed, bomb loads altered. Missions transformed. It flew as level bomber, low-level strafer, gunship, anti-submarine patrol aircraft, and transport. Soviet crews flew them in the north. Chinese and British pilots used them in Asia and Europe. Australian airmen rode in them as part of composite squadrons. Behind each of those variations was the same dynamic that produced the flying cannon: necessity, imagination, and the willingness to experiment under fire. If you trace the arc of the Pacific Air War, from the early days when unescorted bombers droned high and lonely over Rabaul to the late war raids, when swarms of low-flying aircraft ripped through harbors and airfields in coordinated attacks, you can see the fingerprints of that spirit everywhere. It is in the delayed action fuses developed so that bombs could be dropped at mast height without catching the attackers in their own blasts. It is in the skip bombing techniques perfected by practice runs against wrecks and reefs. It is in the way strafing patterns and approach profiles evolved as crews learned painfully what worked and what got them killed. The 75mm Mitchell, then, is not an isolated curiosity. It is a vivid example of how war bends both technology and people into shapes they would never otherwise have taken. It reminds us that behind every line drawing in a technical manual, behind every designation like B-25G or PBJ-1H, there were men and women making decisions under pressure. Some of those decisions were taken in Washington offices, others in Australian workshops, others in the cramped nose of a bomber as it hurtled toward a Japanese ship at wave-top height. Some paid off in destroyed targets and surviving crews. Others led to disappointments like shells that fell short or cannons that proved too cumbersome for the realities of frontline operations. None of them were cost-free. Every time a flying cannon Mitchell went out, its crew risked not only enemy fire but the consequences of their own side's ambition. Every experiment that reached the combat stage carried the possibility of failure measured in casualties, not in abstract graphs. The courage involved was not only in flying low into flak, but in trusting that the innovations built into their aircraft would hold. In that sense, when you picture that first scene again, the B-25 descending at low altitude toward a Japanese ship, the crew bracing as the cannon in the nose fires, you can see more than just a dramatic moment of combat. You can see the long chain of minds and hands that led to that instant: the draftsmen in California, the mechanics in Queensland, the commanders in Brisbane and Washington, the test pilots at Eglin, the ordnance men who adapted a French-designed field piece to an American tank and then to an airplane, the crews who turned doctrine into practice and theory into action. You can see the way a single bold modification, born of desperation and creativity, helped reshape the role of a medium bomber in the Pacific. And as the Mitchell pulls away from its target, water and wreckage falling behind, cannon smoke drifting along the fuselage, You can remember that nearly every famous silhouette of World War II hides similar stories. Under the smooth skin of aluminum and paint, war was constantly rewriting what these machines were meant to do, pushing engineers and crews to adapt and improvise, always searching for one more edge in a conflict where the slightest advantage could mean the difference between life and death. The flying cannon Mitchell was one of the more striking examples of that relentless process, a bomber turned gunship. A tank gun turned anti-shipping weapon, a design bent and reforged by the furnace of the Pacific War. For the men who flew it, it was simply their plane, the one they climbed into at dawn, the one that shook under them when the big gun fired, the one they hoped would carry them back over the jungle and the sea to the rough strips that counted as home. For history, it stands as a reminder that innovation in war is never an abstract thing. It is metal and sweat, fear and courage, failure and success, all compressed into the tight, noisy space of an aircraft cockpit, hurtling toward a target at 200 miles an hour.